great start. I'd like to welcome you this evening to the University Lecture Series, our first for the spring semester. The University Lecture Series was founded in 2018 when Lynchburg College was renamed the University of Lynchburg. This evening we are proud to host Dr. Laura Kicklighter. Dr. Kicklighter earned her PhD in 2002 from University of Texas Medical Branch in Medical Humanities. She earned her MTS from Emory University, as well as a BA in Religious Studies from Stetson University. She joined the University of Lynchburg, then Lynchburg College, in 2005. She is the faculty mentor for our Ethics Bowl team, who was successful this year and went to the national competition. She is the Associate Director of the Westover Honors College and an Associate Professor. Her subject matter includes religious studies, philosophy, medical ethics, as well as senior symposium. Her research is based on the problem of ableism in bioethics and academia in relation to individuals with intellectual disability and end-of-life care. This evening, she will be speaking with us about racism, not race, race, ethics, and allocation in the COVID-19 pandemic. So please join me in giving Dr. Kicklighter a warm welcome.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you for having me here to do the University Lecture Series. This is a topic I'm really excited to be able to further the conversation on. So this is a continuation of a talk I gave to alumni back in August. At that time, I was talking about sort of some more historical aspects of race discrimination in the United States and how that related to health outcomes for racial minorities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today I'm going to be focusing mainly on vaccine hesitancy and medical mistrust in those communities, which was something that was not quite on the horizon yet back at that time in August. So when discussing racism, I'm primarily going to be concerned with anti-Black racism in the United States. However, you're going to probably be able to tell that a lot of the things that I'm talking about will also apply to Indigenous and Latinx communities. And I think we can all agree that structural racism extends far beyond the Black community in the United States. So I'm going to start with the screenshot of a tweet from the Journal of the American Medical Association promoting a JAMA podcast about structural racism for doctors. The podcast was a conversation between the host, Ed Livingston, and his guest, Michael Katz, trying to explain the concept of structural racism to medical professionals. And the tag that they were using to try to get people to listen was, "No physician is racist, so how can there be structural racism in healthcare?" This tweet was quickly taken down and an apology issued by the editor of JAMA, and Ed Livingston was relieved of his duties as host. A lot of people criticized that they took down the tweet instead of leaving it up as an opportunity for conversation. The content of the podcast was also removed from the internet. However, I did have an opportunity to listen to it. The host was basically accused of white-splaining racism. This was a conversation between two white physicians about structural racism, and the conversation centered on the idea of racism, something else. So you can see that we have a problem within medicine about understanding structural racism and how it might affect patient experience and health outcomes, but this problem extends beyond medicine and is really a microcosm of the broader conversation that I believe we need to be having about racism in the United States. So specifically, the host of the AMA podcast, Ed Livingston, has presumed and said explicitly that racism has been eliminated because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and because he personally was taught at home growing up not to be racist. He argued that since doctors don't see color when they treat patients, that it's impossible for a doctor to be racist, and if individual practicing physicians are not racist, there must not be any racism in medicine. So I believe it's important for us to shine a light on the ways in which racism is larger than individual people's attitudes and actions, so that we can see how even if we were able to create a medical establishment where no practicing physicians were actually racist or had explicitly racist ideas, the structural racism that's kind of baked into the system, that I would argue is actually a feature, not a bug, would still pervade and affect health outcomes. So our roadmap for today, we're going to talk about 3 different categories of structural racism. First, we're going to just quickly review the idea of race and structural racism in American society. We'll move on from that to talk about how that affects medical structures in particular and how that relates to health outcomes. And then obviously we'll specifically relate that to the status of COVID-19 and vaccine issues. So first, to talk a little bit about structural racism. Sometimes it's also called systemic racism. I like to use the phrase structural racism because I'm talking about structures such as the medical establishment that have racism built into it as a part of the structure itself. So structural racism has been defined as interconnected social institutions, for example, housing, healthcare, the location of things that would give a person healthcare access like transportation, and all these things are sort of come together to reinforce and legitimize discriminatory beliefs, values, and the distribution of resources. So obviously today we're going to be looking at healthcare resources, but this extends beyond that to other types of resources as well. And it's based on the human construct of race, and specifically we constructed the notion of race in order to apply it in a discriminatory manner. So if you're not familiar with the idea of race as a human construct, I want to start there. Both of these definitions of social construct and power construct come from Ibrahim Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I encourage everyone to take a look at if you want to know more about these definitions. So as you've probably learned, social construct is just a human creation that serves a social purpose, whereas a power construct is one that does that specifically to reinforce a power hierarchy. So that's what's basically going on with race. We can see this historically in the development of racial taxonomies that began to be created by Europeans around the time of the beginning of the slave trade. That sort of evolved into scientific racism. I have scientific in quotes because it was considered scientific at the time, but certainly by our current standards it would not be. And then that of course leads to eugenics. So it is now commonly accepted and known that race is not a biological category. The Human Genome Project revealed that 99.9% of all human DNA is the same, and that the remaining 0.1% is not due to racial differences. So despite this revelation, back in the year 2000, when the Human Genome Project was completed, we continue to think about race as a biological category due to the development of these social and power constructs. So to talk a little bit about human taxonomies, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the history, partially because I myself am not a historian, but because I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about the contemporary applications of this. But racial taxonomies are going to be important in understanding how American medicine was conceived at the time. So racial taxonomies, as I mentioned, became developed around the time of the beginning of the slave trade. So you can imagine why that would be, as white Europeans wanted to have a scientific sounding reason that justified the exploitation and domination and oppression of black and brown bodies. So Francois Bernier is one of the first thinkers who came up with this idea of a racial taxonomy, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a categorization system within the human species that was meant to mimic the categorization that we were developing among plants and animals and other things like that. So usually racial taxonomies posit at least 5 different races of humanity. They can be defined by color, they can be defined by geographical region, and each race is construed to have sort of an ideal type or an essential set of characteristics that everyone within that race is thought to adhere to. So this image is one of many, many images that you can find just by doing a quick Google image search for racial taxonomies. The important thing to note here is that these are all hierarchically defined with white Europeans at the top, and basically the racial hierarchy was thought, once Darwin's theory of evolution came along, to mimic the evolutionary ladder, so that white European males were considered to be the height of evolutionary progress, and essentially to to sum it up, the darker a person's skin was, the less evolved they were considered to be. So this laid the groundwork for scientific racism, which is still used today in some instances to justify and erase slavery, historically speaking. So when we're talking about scientific racism and how it affects science both historically and in the present time, we can see look back to the American practice of eugenics in the 1920s and following as an example of this. So we've jumped ahead multiple centuries, as you can see, from the 1600s to the 1900s, and we still have white American society holding on very tightly to this idea of scientific racism as a justification for differential treatment. So what was going on in the eugenics movement, and specifically in the state of Virginia, which was at the forefront of that movement, was the construction of the race of whiteness in order to differentiate the white ideal from the less desirable other races. So we can see this really specifically in the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which gives us a legal definition of whiteness in order to prohibit interracial marriage. So we can see already why I'm calling this structural and institutionalized racism and not just something that kind of pervades society in a more nebulous way. So the excerpt that I have here defines racism or defines a white person as someone who has no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasians, but unless it's 1/16 or less of the blood of American Indian. So we don't have time to get into why they were willing to make that one exception, but you can see that they were very concerned specifically that anyone with any blood, quote unquote, that was not white be excluded from this definition of whiteness. So the purpose of defining whiteness for them, as I said, was to promote good marriages that would produce good and healthy offspring that would create increasingly fit generations of citizens in future years. This was also about the time that eugenic sterilizations began. So in Virginia, the famous case is the Carrie Buck case in around the same time period. Eugenic sterilizations of people considered socially undesirable, and especially minority groups, African Americans and Latinx populations, continued in the United States through the 1970s. So this is something that began in the 1920s but was perpetuated for quite a long time based on these notions of biological race and racial superiority and inferiority. So moving on from that to what this has to do with American medicine, I am going to still stay within the sort of historical context for a little bit. So all of these racial categories were used to justify problematic experimentation, exploitation of black bodies in medical research. So historian Susan Reverby calls these three experiments the holy trinity of racial horrors in medical experimentation in the United States. So the image that we have here is an image of J. Marion Sims. He is considered to be the father of American gynecology. He invented multiple gynecological innovations that are still used today, including the surgery used to repair an injury that women experience during childbirth called a fistula. He invented the use of the forceps and multiple other gynecological surgeries that were used to benefit wealthy white women, but the experimentation that was done on them was done on enslaved African women. So these were women who were enslaved and owned actually by Sims, and you can imagine that the issue or the idea of informed consent to being a research subject is not something that would have crossed anyone's mind during this time period. So that's Sims there on the right, looking very sternly at the enslaved woman that he is about to experiment on, and then you can see the other two women kind of peeking from behind the curtain. His victims' names were Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, and I think it's important for us to remember those names. Most people are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this was a study on untreated syphilis in the African American male that lasted for a period of 40 years. It was only discontinued when a journalist finally broke the story and published it in a lay newspaper. So that is something that was carried on and perpetuated for a long, long period of time. And in addition, most people by now are familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks cells were used in research without her knowledge and consent, and they were actually used in the development of some of the COVID-19 vaccines that we are all now getting. So when we're talking about the legacy of medical experimentation, some people refer to these instances as a possible reason why Black communities today or Black individuals today might be hesitant to receive something like the COVID-19 vaccine, because they might be hesitant to be used as another research subject or something like that. One of the things that I want to point out is, although these are profound examples of structural racism in the history of medicine, a person doesn't necessarily have to be cognizant of these historical incidents in order to have very good reasons to mistrust the medical profession. So I'm presenting these as both a potential reason for mistrust, but also as a clear example of our historical legacy that we should not be proud of in this country, of structural racism that is cloaked in scientific language. We can also see structural racism at play in the professionalization of American medicine. So basically what was happening, the American Medical Association is the premier professional association for allopathic physicians in the United States. Allopathic as contrast to osteopathic. So the American Medical Association was established in 1847 with the primary goal of creating more professional clout for medical doctors. So basically what was happening in medicine during that time was medical doctors who had obtained formal medical training were competing against people who had just done maybe an apprenticeship under a practicing physician. They were competing against irregulars, people who were like naturopaths, for example, or something like that. They were also competing against female midwives. They were competing against multiple other people who claimed to have medical knowledge that we might now put in the category of like a snake oil salesman. So the American medical establishment had a good reason to try to professionalize. What was happening between 1847 and 1870 were a lot of conversations about how to organize, how to professionalize, who should be included or excluded. There's a very long article that I found very interesting that's in my citations at the end that I would refer you to if you want more information on this. But basically what was going on is that multiple sort of state and local medical groups would send delegations to the National American Medical Association meeting every year, and the AMA leaders would have to decide whether to accept them, whether to admit them into the AMA. So in 1870, there were two groups that caused quite a stir. One was an all-white group that incurred irregulars like naturopaths. They wanted to be accepted. And another was a mixed race group that also wanted to be accepted. And in 1870, the racially integrated delegations were explicitly excluded, while the all-white groups that included irregulars like naturopaths were included. So that set up a precedent of deliberate exclusion of non-white physicians from the medical establishment. This continued for quite a long time. Another watershed moment in the professionalization of medicine is the very well-known Flexner Report in 1910. Abraham Flexner reviewed all of the medical schools in the United States during his time and issued recommendations that included the closing of a lot of medical schools, because he said there were more medical schools than we needed. We were producing more doctors with low standards compared to what we needed. He also advocated for segregated medicine and medical practice, which isn't very surprising for 1910. But interestingly, even though there weren't enough medical schools training Black physicians, the result of the Flexner Report was that all Black medical schools except for two closed in short order. And those two Black medical schools are still open today at Howard University and Meharry Medical School. So all of this resulted in segregated medical practice and segregated medical education that was happening in such a way that there were an insufficient number of Black physicians being educated and an insufficient number of white physicians who were willing to treat Black patients. So that meant that Black Americans were not receiving the same access to medical care as white Americans were. So to tell you a little bit more about the progress that we've made since 1900, in 1900, 2% of the total physicians in the United States were Black. In 2020, it reached an all-time high of 5%. And now in 2021, we're back down to 4%. There are multiple reasons for this that I don't have a lot of time to go into. Some of this has to do with the structural issues that I'm going to talk about in a little bit with regard to Black communities and their access to quality schools, race biases and testing, those kinds of things, as well as people being mentored and encouraged to go into these kinds of professions. Right now, even if you look at residency programs, Black residents only comprise 4% of the total population there also. Residency programs have a lot of control over who ultimately gets to become a doctor. And because there are a limited number of spots within residency programs, it's not just a simple matter of let's just admit more African American students or graduates of medical school to these residency programs, because the AMA basically controls all of this. They set the number of residency programs, they set the number of individuals, total number of people who get admitted to them. So you would have to completely change the residency system, which a lot of people have advocated for, to allow more people to enter residencies overall in order to increase the numbers of minorities, the numbers of people with learning disabilities, and like other issues that people have been traditionally excluded from medical education. So even right now in American medicine, students who have gone through medical school are not guaranteed a placement because we're graduating more students than we have spots in residencies. So to say a little bit more about medical science and race, to take this more to the present day, we can still see these racial stereotypes that I've been talking about and resulting health disparities. So whether it's with maternal health, fetal health, incarceration rates, which affects a person's health as well, infectious diseases, as we all know with COVID-19, spreads much more rapidly in tight quarters, so prisoners are experiencing a lot more negative effects of this, and as I hope we're all aware, prisons are very, very disproportionately populated by Black and brown Americans. There's also a lot of social resistance to programs that would be thought to benefit Black Americans due to presumed laziness among people who might be the recipients of those programs, which again is tinted with racist attitudes. So that's still rooted in racialized medicine. And all of this is going to come together to form kind of a perfect storm when we're talking about COVID-19 outcomes, access to treatment, and access to vaccines. So to turn now to the issue of structural racism as it applies specifically to COVID-19, this is an excellent graphic that I did not create. It comes from a website that provides amazing data. It's called COVID Black, and it's part of a project that is specifically designed to help people disseminate and communicate data about the connection between race and COVID-19. So it gives us a great image of how structural racism works, specifically with relation to COVID-19. So structural racism is going to affect multiple areas in a person's life that are directly related to the likelihood that they will catch COVID-19 or their health outcomes once they do contract the disease. So we have the issue of Black and brown people being more likely to be frontline workers. Frontline workers tend to be lower paid than other types of workers, less likely to be able to work from home, obviously. Residential patterns are an important aspect here. So the practice of redlining and segregating communities means that certain populations are going to be forced into living in certain areas that then have less access to things like transportation, less access to things like pharmacies. A lot of Black and brown neighborhoods are pharmacy deserts, for example. And then we have the poor response of the federal government and the general lack of access to health care. So what I really like about this image is it shows how all of these structural racism issues and things that we might not think of as directly health related, like residential patterns, come together to create, as I said, a perfect storm surrounding COVID-19. So when we're looking at race and health disparities in COVID-19, Black Americans are 4 times more likely than white Americans to contract the virus. Without adjusting for age, they're twice as likely to die from COVID-19, but if we adjust for age, they're almost 4 times more likely, so 3.6 times more likely. The reason why it's important to adjust for age is that there are more older Americans who are white than there are older Americans who are minorities. So because white Americans tend to live longer, if you don't adjust for age, it actually skews the results. So you can see already that when we're talking about health disparities, we're not talking about these outcomes based on biological differences. So some people would look at these numbers and say, well, there must be something going on biologically in minorities and Black and brown people that results in these worse outcomes. But the important thing to keep in mind is this is entirely based on social determinants of health and the health outcomes of living in residential areas that lack access and resources that might create the presence of underlying conditions or other health problems, but there's no biological or genetic thing going on inside the bodies of Black and brown Americans that is by itself creating these outcomes. One thing that relates to this, as I mentioned, is frontline and essential workers. So racial capitalism is a term coined by Senator Robert Robinson in 1983. It refers to the role that race plays in hierarchical structures in capitalist societies. Specifically, the use of lower earning minority workers to benefit white managers and higher wage earners. If you take that together with the inverse hazard law, which says that the more hazardous a person's job is, the less the pay usually is for that job, you can see how this is going to come together to create a system of exploitation, and then we're talking about in time of infectious diseases, a situation in which there's going to be more risk for infection. So less than 1 in 5 black workers can work from home compared to about 1 in 3 white workers. And those essential workers are concentrated in these industries that we've probably all heard a news story about rampant COVID-19 spreading in one of these industries. The meatpacking industry was in the news quite a bit, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Construction primarily affects Latinx communities. Healthcare, that does not include medical doctors, you might not be surprised to learn, but rather lower level healthcare workers tend to be predominantly minority groups, especially when we're talking about things like nurses' aides, people who are working in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And in prisons and jails, it's actually the workers who tend to be white and the inmates who tend to be minorities. But we've all probably, I'm sure you've all heard the news stories about COVID-19 spreading in prisons and jails, which is one of the reasons why vaccination efforts are sometimes concentrated there. In New York City, 75% of New York City's essential workers are persons of color. So let's take this now to the issue of vaccination. So when we look at vaccines and the impact of structural racism on vaccines, we can think about that in 3 different categories. One is the clinical trials for those vaccines. Those are quite fraught. In clinical trials, generally, the standard patient is considered to be a white male, and any other types of patients, whether it's a woman patient or a pediatric patient or a non-white patient, is considered to be a deviation from that norm. So most clinical trial results are results that tell us what works in the bodies of white, able-bodied men. And some of that data isn't able to be extrapolated to other communities because of common underlying conditions or biological difference between the sexes, or if we're talking about children, obviously there are going to be biological differences there as well. I already talked a little bit about a lack of trustworthiness on the part of scientific researchers, partially because of those experiments that I mentioned earlier, but also because of a general mistrust in the medical community, or in the African American community, of the medical establishment. So all of this comes together to result in low enrollment of black research subjects in medical experiments, specifically in the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. There's been a lot of hesitancy and pushback. Black and brown Americans are not very eager to be used as guinea pigs for the benefit of white Americans who want to get the vaccine. So there's a big concern that they're going to bear the burden but not reap the benefits of participating in that research. And in addition to that, we have the question of allocation as well, right? So if we are thinking about resource allocation and we want to privilege those communities that might be able to benefit the most, who's thinking about how that benefit works is going to influence that dynamic and that calculation. So clinical trials is one area where we actually didn't do very well. Most of the subjects in those clinical trials were white men. And so because of that, we don't really have any data about how that works for other groups whose health conditions might be influenced by those social factors that I talked about. With vaccine access, I think we can all agree that the flawed rollout of the vaccine delivery system in the United States has made a lot of the reflections that bioethicists and others about how we should allocate vaccines moot. So prior to the rollout, when everybody kind of thought it was going to be this nice, well-organized effort, there was a lot of speculation on the part of bioethicists about how should we do this? Is it fair? Is it safe to give it to minority communities first, or are they going to think we're experimenting on them? How do we do that? And then once the vaccine rolled out, everybody wanted it and nobody could get it. So the issue of vaccine access can affect minority communities and lower socioeconomic groups, especially because, as I mentioned, those residential areas tend to be pharmacy deserts, meaning it's not easy to get to a pharmacy to get the vaccine. In addition to that, It's not easy for some people, especially if you think about a city like Lynchburg, where public transportation is not as accessible as it would be in a larger area. It's not easy for people to get to those places where they might have access to those things. In addition to that, many don't know that you don't need insurance and that the vaccine itself is free, and so people might think that they're barred from getting it just based on cost alone. The main thing that I want to talk about today, and the last thing I'm going to talk about, is the issue of vaccine hesitancy. So I don't know how well you can see this graphic. I'm going to kind of explain it a little bit. This is from an NPR PBS poll that asked, I think it's from earlier this month, yes, March 3rd. So relatively recent. If a vaccine for the coronavirus was made available to you, will you choose to be vaccinated? So these numbers are getting a little bit better compared to when this was just a theoretical question back in December or January, and most people hadn't actually had the vaccine offered to them, and people were a little bit skeptical of what might happen if they were to get vaccinated. So you can see that African Americans are actually not the largest group that says they would not get the vaccine. Republican men, 49% of them said no, and only, well, 51% said yes, they already received it, or they weren't sure. So, and only slightly less than that, they separated out Republican men and people who supported Trump, but you can see people who supported Trump, which is a multi-gender category, is roughly similar. That's the third line down. So the bottom line is the black population. Only 25% of the black population answered absolutely no to the question of will you get vaccinated. So some people might ask, why are we so worried about vaccine hesitancy in the black community if 75% of them are saying they probably will get it or they're not quite sure, and only 25% is saying no? Well, a couple reasons. One is mathematically, we need them to get vaccinated. In order to reach herd immunity, we need way more percentages than this chart depicts in order to be vaccinated in order to get there. So it's important to figure out how to reach these communities that are saying no. And the reasons why people who are in this category of Republican men or people who supported Trump, those people's reasons against getting the vaccine are very, very different than the reasons of Black or Latinx populations who are worried more about racial oppression and harm to themselves rather than believing in a conspiracy theory or something like that. So when we get to the issue of medical mistrust and vaccine hesitancy, I think our discourse is a little bit misguided. I think instead of talking about medical mistrust, we should talk about medical untrustworthiness. Because the medical establishment, whether we're talking about the U.S. Public Health Service or we're talking about actual doctor-patient clinical relationships, hasn't presented itself and shown itself to be a trustworthy partner to Black and brown Americans. So medical mistrust is a rational response to systemic oppression. It is rational and understandable not to trust the very institutions and individuals who contributed to centuries and centuries of oppression of yourselves and your ancestors. So because of this, we can't really fight this with top-down approaches that just shove more data at a person or say, no, really, it's science, you can trust the medical establishment. Most African Americans surveyed have said that they're more distrustful of the government than they are of the medical establishment. So any message that comes from a government body is going to be met with even more skepticism than a message that comes from a medical point of view. So with regard to how to establish that trustworthiness and what we ought to be doing, there are a few ways and recommendations that we can talk about doing this. So when we're talking about mistrust, we need to address the reasons for that mistrust and explicitly acknowledge structural racism. So to get you to recall the tweet that I mentioned earlier, those posts were criticized because they didn't want to talk about structural racism. That made them, as two white men, too uncomfortable. They were worried that people wouldn't want to talk about racism and wouldn't want to talk about these issues if we called it racism. Trying to erase the reality like that is a way to perpetuate medical mistrust among the very people that we need to reestablish trustworthiness with. So when we're talking about mistrust, we need to make sure that we're remembering that explicit acknowledgement of the problem, acknowledging there's a problem, is the first step towards fixing the problem, right? So as long as we continue to have conversations that cater to white people's sensitive feelings about talking about racism, or maybe trying to avoid the word racism because it might cause people to shut down, I believe we need to explicitly acknowledge the problem of structural racism and the consequences that has for the everyday lives of many people. And then we need institutions to demonstrate their trustworthiness. And they can do that by creating plans that focus on equity, by doing this acknowledgement in educational efforts. So, for example, some have advocated for explicit structural racism education as part of the medical school curriculum, which would allow doctors to be educated not just, hey, don't discriminate among your patients based on the color of their skin, but here is our own history. Here is our own legacy of how we have used racism to create legitimacy for white physicians in this country, and here's the effect that that has had on Black and brown people in the United States. I don't know personally how realistic that would be, because if medical schools really pride themselves on, we have this really rigorous curriculum, and how could we ever possibly fit anything else in? I am sure that if they were committed, they would be able to find a way. But that's been one way that the medical establishment, quote unquote, could demonstrate trustworthiness, by explicitly acknowledging and educating. I personally don't believe that public apologies are very useful in that way. The American Medical Association and the JAMA podcast did apologize. Once they removed the tweet, they removed the podcast, they did a new podcast, and it was also a video that you can watch on YouTube, and it was the current editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association with a group of 3 African-American healthcare professionals, 2 physicians and 1 public health worker, talking about structural racism in medicine. So they did kind of try to do the right thing. There were some problems with it. I mean, they're talking about a lot of history and didn't really bring in any historians, for example. And like I said, there was criticism of them for taking down the earlier tweet and for taking down the earlier podcast, which it would have been nice if they had left that up so that we could talk about that and talk about the problems there. So the focus on equity goes beyond words, though. So, for example, emphasizing informed consent, emphasizing equity of access to therapies. And by therapies, you could include vaccines in that, equity of access to vaccines, but also the therapies that we use to treat diseases like COVID-19. So we've all seen instances where politicians like Chris Christie or Donald Trump, who are very well connected, get access to treatments that the average American would not have access to. And on a lower level, white Americans with health insurance have access to a lot of therapeutics that people who lack health insurance or who lack access to basic medical care do not have access to. So making a commitment to equity in that way, an organized effort, in other words, instead of just kind of a reminder to stop being racist, would go quite a long way. Another thing that's been emphasized quite a bit, and that I'm going to get to these 3 images on the bottom, is grassroots efforts and advocacy, and specifically communication from Black health professionals to the Black community. That is the main thing that's going to carry the most weight in terms of trustworthiness, as opposed to the U.S. government saying, we really want you to get vaccinated, even if that's coming from a health-related government body like the Public Health Service, or your local politician encouraging you to get vaccinated. Because as I said, 60% of African Americans said they didn't trust the government, only 20% said they didn't trust the medical establishment. So the government is really the worst way to go about trying to regain trust and restoring trustworthiness. I will say that the study that I read that said that was done during the Trump administration. It might be different now, I don't know. But with regard to the use of Black health professionals in Black communities, we have 3 examples on the bottom. I encourage anybody who's watching who might be interested in learning more to visit all 3 of these websites. So the Black Coalition Against COVID is a DC-based project that is designed to organize community leaders to help connect members of African American communities in DC to vaccine access and other healthcare resources, specifically to have Black health professionals educate those in their own communities. So that is one way to help really rebuild trust, and that's a grassroots effort. COVID Black, which is where the image came from that I showed you earlier, is a data analytics and visualizations effort done by and for racial minorities in the United States. They have all kinds of amazing data on Black health outcomes and healthcare access, and a lot of it is obviously COVID related. And then this last one, Between Us, About Us, is an effort by medical doctor Rhea Boyd, who is dedicated to promoting vaccine acceptability among the African American community. This is a huge group of Black healthcare workers and leaders doing outreach to the Black community. They have people making videos talking straight to the listener about all kinds of basically frequently asked questions type questions. So you might have heard this, let me tell you what it's really like. So their big celebrities, there's W. Kamau Bell, who you may have heard of from his show on CNN, United Shades of America. He's got a video on there as well, but it's predominantly Black healthcare workers doing this effort, so that's why it's called Between Us, About Us. It was by and for African American citizens. And I have a ton of resources here. I'm happy to share these with anybody as a Google document if there's anybody listening who wants to know more. There is a lot of information on this, and there will be even more coming out as time goes on. And thank you. I look forward to any questions.
Question?
Can I ask about the percentages of blacks in medical schools, and I mean, it's unrelated to COVID, well, it isn't, but what could possibly be done about that? I mean that's just amazing statistic that I guess I've not really thought about, but 5%, 4% in the 21st century seems absurd.
Yes.
What structural things can be, we'll explain it, but also can change it?
So the medical system is basically a huge old boy network. So that's one thing that would need to change right away. So in terms of getting people to write letters of admissions, how a person is perceived as coming across in a medical school interview, all of those things are sort of unofficial cues that influence a person's ability to get into medical school. You also have the technical standards for admission to medical school that are all these non-academic standards that I think are discriminatory against students with learning disabilities, like people who have a manageable mental illness, for example, would be afraid to disclose that because technical standards require things like collegiality and the ability to get along with others and the ability to do certain physical things that a person might not ever need to do when they're practicing medicine, but it's considered a standard for admission to medical school. With regard to the residency specifically, the Maine Medical Honors Association, you get into that entirely through the Old Boy Network, so you have someone who's already in it nominate you for it. And it's so important to be in that for residency that there's a box like right at the top of the application that you check, are you in this organization or not? So that's another one where you get into it by like the people who are in it saying, oh, I know that person, they're fine, let's let them in, right? So it's just not set up to be something that's based on an objective assessment of the person's merits in any way, shape, or form. And also there's like, they purposely keep the number of slots small so that it will elevate the prestige, because if you keep the demand high and the supply low, then that's why doctors make so much money. You can't see me smiling, but.
So, Laura, is there any move in individual medical practices to become more diverse, either in partners or, healthcare workers within the practice?
Yeah, there probably are. I mean, I don't personally know of any of them. I think that is going to become more difficult as medical practices become more corporatized. So there are very few independently owned medical practices anymore. Some of that's a response to regulation, like all of the computerization and the reporting of the insurance stuff. Doctors don't want to have to do that anymore, so it's easy because it's very burdensome and time consuming. So, I mean, there's a reason why most of the doctors here in Lynchburg work for Centra, right? So I think that that would be a small scale way to do it within one medical practice. I wouldn't rely on that to make the system better.
What about larger corporate medical, like Centra or, Carillion or other groups like that? It seems like to me, it seems like a good corporate initiative, to have a more diverse workforce.
Yes.
So do you see that happening at all?
I haven't looked into that, so I don't know. I couldn't say off the top of my head. I would hope so. I think you would need more than a mission statement that said we want a more diverse workforce because of all these other structural problems. We're just not graduating that many minority positions. So kind of like in academia, right? You're like, oh, weird, all the applicants are white. Well, what can you do? You know, like we have to do more than just say we want to hire more. Like it's kind of a burn it all down and start over solution.
So going back to the education, I've heard a couple times about the some racial problems with standardized testing. So I imagine the MCATs is not immune to that either. So
Yeah.
medical schools would be right off the bat starting from a disadvantage just because of that. Right?
Yeah, and it goes back. I mean, actually goes back to the SAT too, because if the SAT, somebody could argue that the MCAT can't be racially biased because it's testing scientific knowledge, but in order to take the MCAT, you have to get into college. In order to get into a good college, you have to take the SAT until this year when everybody went test optional, right? So maybe that'll end up being good for diversity. And then once you're in college, you have to have faculty who are able and willing to recognize and encourage students of color to go into these fields because you need those letters of recommendation. So yeah, it's a multi-level thing. The MCAT itself, the content is objective science, so it's not as likely to be racially biased as like a word problem on the SAT or something. But all of the things that need to happen in order for a person to get to that point. And then there's a big problem with the MCAT and ableism because technically you're able to get accommodations for taking the test, but you also have to tell the medical schools that you have a disability and you ask for those accommodations, and then that could affect your admissions to medical school.
You have to divulge that?
Yeah, that's a total violation of the ADA.
How do they get away with that?
They just do. It's doctors, man. They do whatever they want.
What?
We had a whole ethics board case about that. It was eye-opening.
I'll do the two most conferencey things ever.
Sweet.
First, more comment than a question, and second, related to my own field. But I think it's when you talk about the establishment of the American Medical Association as a way to basically consolidate power, right? Like shut other people out. And I studied midwives in the 18th century, and they had to sort of come before a court and testify. And that was how they started to professionalize and push women out of it, and male midwives came in, willed their forceps and everything. And so I just think it's fascinating that it's structural in that it's baked in, but it's also structural in that we respond to it, right? We're like, oh, the AMA said so.
Oh, for sure,
so
yeah.
it's so self-perpetuating at every possible level that it does feel like burden to the ground. But we have to change all of our mindsets too, because they're the authorities, since they said that they were the authorities, and there's no,
Yeah, but what could be more authoritative than something the AMA said,
Right,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, their plan worked.
no doctors are racist.
Yeah, no doctors are racist. What are you talking about?
Is there any difference in osteopathic medical schools?
I haven't looked into that either. I did think about that as I was putting this together, and I just ran out of time, so I just focused on allopathic.
Yeah.
I would be curious to know that answer.
I would
as
be
well.
too. Fascinating.
I'll research it and get back to you, Allison.
Any other questions? All right. Well, Laura, we have a little gift for you. In appreciation of all that you've done to prepare for the lecture and for everything that you do for the university.